Is Ramona Flowers toxic? Yes and no. If we're talking about the film version, then yes, absolutely. In the film, we learn that Ramona has a complicated past, having dated several men who have hurt her in various ways. Instead of dealing with this trauma and moving on, Ramona chooses to constantly move to new cities and start new relationships, never fully confronting her feelings or taking responsibility for her actions. This behavior is particularly evident in her treatment of Scott. Ramona is quick to move in with Scott and rely on him for emotional support, but she also consistently pushes him away when he tries to get to know her better. She keeps important details about her past hidden from him, and even when he does learn about her previous relationships, she is dismissive and vague about the details. Ramona also frequently puts Scott in dangerous situations, both physically and emotionally, without considering the impact on him. In one notable scene, Ramona invites Scott to a concert. They realize that the concert is a fight to the death with one of her ex-boyfriends. Rather than warning Scott or trying to protect him, Ramona watches as he fights for his life, only stepping to intervene when he is in danger. Even then, she doesn't lift a finger to help Scott when he is fighting the leader of the deadly X's, Gideon, only content to sit by and watch as Gideon and Scott battle to the death, gladly watching silently as both men have become pawns in her own emotional games. She seems to get a thrill out of watching Scott suffer and struggle despite claiming to care about him. Finally, Ramona is toxic in her inability to take responsibility for her own actions. Throughout the film, she consistently blames others for her problems and refuses to accept any responsibility for her own mistakes. When Scott confronts her about her past relationship, she deflects and makes excuses rather than owning up to her behavior. She even goes so far as to blame Scott for her decision to run back to Gideon, even though it was entirely her own choice. All of this happens in the span of a few days within the film adaptation. But once I read the comic, something interesting happened. I began to see Ramona in a different light. You see, the comics, aka the original source material for the movie, has 6 volumes, each which have their own central theme that fleshes out Ramona as a character. In the first volume, Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life, we are introduced to the world of Scott Pilgrim and focus on themes of aimlessness, immaturity, and the fear of commitment, and is an exploration of Scott Pilgrim as a character. He's a 23-year-old slacker living in a dingy apartment and doesn't have his own job, as he mooches off his gay roommate Wallace and is dating a 17-year-old named Knives simply because it was easy. Scott was content with his life until he met Ramona, where both characters hit it off romantically very quickly and defeated the first evil ex, Matthew Patel, someone who Ramona only dated in middle school because Matthew would beat up all of her bullies. In the second volume, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, is another Scott-focused volume as it delves into all of Scott Pilgrim's past relationships, a flashback of Scott breaking up with Kim Pines, and finally the traumatic effect Envy Adams caused when she broke up with Scott. It is in Volume 3, Scott Pilgrim and the Infinite Sadness, that I began to see the greatness of Ramona's character. In this volume, the aforementioned Envy Adams, who is now a celebrity, and her boyfriend, the mega vegan Todd, are the main antagonists. In this volume, Scott is outclassed both mentally, physically, and psychically by this power couple, constantly haunted by the awful way his past relationship with Envy ended. Where Scott lacked focus, direction, and drive, Ramona picked up the pieces and became, in my eyes, the ultimate girlfriend. Ramona supported Scott at his lowest, took care of him, and even cut his hair for him, in a scene that I thought was absolutely adorable. Ramona single-handedly carried this volume and destroyed the hold Envy had over Scott, destroying her facade as a seemingly perfect person, exposing her as someone that doesn't really have anyone that cares about her beyond her superficial fame, as Todd was cheating on Envy with her security guard. If the series ended here, I would have told you that Ramona Flowers was wife material and that any accusations of her being toxic was just slander. But it doesn't end here. We still have 3 more volumes. Volume 4, aka Scott Pilgrim Gets It Together, is a volume where Scott starts getting his life together, but it's also the volume where we start to see the cracks in Ramona as a character. The beginning of this volume starts out on a high note, and Ramona is still carrying the best girl momentum from the last volume. Scott gets a job washing dishes at a restaurant, and Ramona allows Scott to move in with her, where both contribute to the household equally. Things seem to be perfect until Scott's old high school friend Lisa Miller is in town. Now, Scott is a complete idiot, but to any other person, including the viewer and Ramona, it's clear that Lisa has a huge crush on Scott. This jealousy starts to unravel Ramona at the seams, and she begins to become a lot more hostile in this volume, not to mention the stress of Scott finding out that one of her evil exes was a girl named Roxanne, as he doesn't want to fight a woman and refuses to touch her, which causes Ramona to intervene and save Scott. This stress culminates in Ramona kicking Scott out of her house and allowing Roxanne into her home for the night. So he turns to Lisa, to which she gladly accepts Scott into her house and tries to seduce him, to which Scott turns down. In this moment, Scott realizes that he loves Ramona and races to her house, fights Roxanne to the death, where he wins. The volume ends with Scott and Ramona professing their love for one another in a very sweet moment. The problem with this moment, and the fight between Scott and Roxanne, is that throughout this volume, people would refer to Scott as a coward because he doesn't want to drink or smoke, which was obviously said as a joke. However, when Roxanne calls Scott a coward, he looks to Ramona, and Ramona agrees that Scott can indeed be a coward at times. I found this moment baffling, especially since by this point, Scott has killed 3 of Ramona's exes, all of which Scott have never been obligated to handle. These are Ramona's issues, and Scott shouldn't have to endure being called a coward for refusing to hit a woman. But I do understand that this was a moment that acted as a metaphor in relation to Scott refusing to take his relationship with Ramona to the next level. But I'm not looking past that part, where she kissed Roxanne. Volume 5, Scott Pilgrim vs. the Universe, is where Ramona is at her absolute worst as a character. She becomes paranoid and angry after learning that Scott had cheated on knives with her, effectively 2-timing them both. But in the same volume, it was revealed that Ramona did the exact same thing to the twins and manipulated them in a way that almost pitted them against each other, showing her hypocrisy as a person, to which she ends the volume by running away from Scott, abetting both her house and her cats. Volume 6 is where she makes her triumphant return and helps Scott in his climactic battle against Gideon, where it's revealed that in her mind there's still a part of her that wants to be a slave to Gideon again, and even named one of her cats after him, which is super weird, I'm not gonna lie. But Ramona discards that part of herself that loves being a slave and frees herself from Gideon's control. After the battle was finished, Ramona reaffirmed her love for Scott and revealed that she had just run away to her dad's house to hide from the world by playing video games and watching the X-Files. To which everyone says that Scott and Ramona are basically perfect for each other because that's basically what they did when they broke up. They did the exact same thing. In the end, I think Ramona has some toxic traits, but I do think that she's trying to become a better person. And like everyone else in the world, Ramona is a 3-dimensional character that has a lot of depth to her. Ramona can be wife material at times, and in others can be just as flawed. Scott Pilgrim is another basket case who is far from perfect, and in my opinion, might be worse than Ramona. If you like this video, subscribe. See ya.